My plan today is to start by just explaining a little bit about who Mina Loy is, to try and give you some coordinates for her. And then I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of this book that Sasha has just mentioned, the work that I'm doing, from which this talk comes. And so then I will sort of switch over to a kind of more broader conversation about the relationship between esotericism and the avant-garde. And then I will move into a conversation about Mina Loy as an esotericist and how we might perceive her in this way, and then move to her very strange, pervasive, esoteric Eros, this theory she starts developing and calls it such, esoteric Eros, in her later writings, although it underpins a lot of what she does in her early work as well. So that's my basic plan. Let me begin. Mina Loy is a British-born author, but also an artist. So she's from 1882, she's born in North London, and she dies in 1966 in Aspen, Colorado. Her mother was an English Protestant, and her father was a Jewish Hungarian migrant, so she considered herself mixed race, and the term she used for this is mongrel. She said she had a kind of mongrel identity. That's a big part of her writing. Loy lived in Italy as Futurism got underway. She lived in New York as it embraced Dada, and she was in Paris as Surrealism was established. She was always in the right place at the right time. She was an artist who exhibited in prestigious Parisian salons, as well as the now legendary Society of Independence Artists show in New York in 1917. So she did give a lot of, create a lot of exhibitions of her work throughout her life. Through the 1910s and the 1920s, Mina Loy published avant-garde poems, often explicit, often satiric, in the small journals that came to define Anglo-American modernism, so the Dial and the Little Review, others, various journals like this. She has had one book in her lifetime, which was called Lunar Baedeker. It was published in 1923 and reprinted in 1958. So a version of it was reprinted. Her reputation didn't really sort of rest with her books per se, it's more with her journal publications. Loy associated with Gertrude Stein, with Marinetti, with James Joyce, with Gina Barnes, and Marcel Duchamp, among countless other major figures of the period, just incredibly well connected. She embraced avant-garde circles throughout her youth, and come middle age, she was believed to be a recluse who was no longer artistically active. We now know, because of her archive, that this is absolutely not the case, that she was producing a great deal of art, a lot of assemblage art out of eggshells and found objects, and Duchamp hosted a show of that artwork in the 50s. She was also writing some poems, but what she was really obsessed with at the end of her life was a series of autobiographical novels that are interconnected. They're kind of Kunstroman that were portraits of the artist as a young woman, but they were also treatises on mysticism, feminism, and aesthetics. So this kind of combination of pursuits. In her late life, she continued to have admirers. The American novelist Henry Miller wrote the blurb for a reissue of Loy's poems in 1958. Members of Black Mountain College sought her out, as did the artist Joseph Cornell, with whom Loy became very close in the 1940s. So she still remains kind of in contact with these important figures. And the influential American poet-critic Kenneth Rexroth really worked in the 1940s to start resurrecting her legacy. And off the back of some of his work, alongside Jonathan Williams, the second-wave feminist critics started to pick Mina Loy up again, right? And so she became resurrected and brought back into the canon. If you were a cynic, which I am, you might say that Loy is at risk of becoming the next token woman modernist. So she sort of is supplanting Gertrude Stein in the United States, and she's supplanting Virginia Woolf in the UK. You'll find a lot of PhD dissertations in Anglo-American circles have a chapter on Mina Loy now, where they used to have a chapter on Stein or Woolf. So that's a very, very brief overview of who Mina Loy is. I'm going to explain for you now a little bit about the kind of basic structure of this book that I've written, which has turned into 2 volumes, much to my amazement and my publishers being very generous about publishing them both. It's called An Anatomy of Mina Loy, An Anatomy of Mina Loy. I just submitted it last week, so it's very freshly completed. I've been working on it for over 10 years. It is an in-depth exploration of Loy's relationship to the human body, which is what everyone always talks about when they talk about Loy. She's fascinated with the human body, right? But this Relationship to the body in Loy is inextricable from an esoteric understanding of the human soul. Soul and body are not divided in Loy's thinking. So the first volume of the anatomy that I've written is subtitled Nethered Regions, and it deals with the lower half of the body. So it has individual chapters that are devoted to Loy's presentation of toes, feet, legs, genitals, belly, and the womb. Right? That's the first volume. And the second volume is subtitled Elevated Realms, and it addresses the upper half of the body. So it's Loy's presentation of heart, back, nerves, and eyes. And by eyes, I mean all three of them, because she's very interested in the third eye as well. So volume 1 begins with Loy's approach to ontology, or what she calls being alive. Being alive is a kind of refrain in her work. It's a kind of counterpart to her Bergsonian Elan Vital or Gertrude Stein's being existing. Being existing is also a refrain in Stein's work. Being alive for Loy consists of thinking through the baseline of what constitutes sentient life. Now, Loy is very aware that marginalized individuals, women like herself, Jews like herself, the poor and the disabled, are often equated with mere sentience. They're seen as existence, and their intellects and complexities are disregarded. Right? They just have a heartbeat, that's it. Loy's interest in ontology extends to fascinations with primitivism, with evolution, and vitalism. And I'm positing Loy in this first volume in particular as an atavistic avant-gardist, Her experimentalism is rooted in a very self-reflexive fascination with a distant evolutionary past, particularly an evolutionary past when it becomes perverse or deviant. This is what interests her, these kind of perversions or deviances of evolution. And this regressive backward interest, of course, is a kind of cliche of the period, right? Modernists have this interest. As long as it's not Victorian, it's okay to go backward, right? It's okay if it's mythology, if it's the ancients, if it's classics. But I'm arguing in this book that this return to the atavistic takes on a different cast within the work of individuals who are perceived as inseparable from it, right? This kind of reversion or this backwardness. Mina Loy knows, for instance, that women and Jews are seen as underdeveloped examples of human evolution. They are ineradicably primitive, they are unable to progress. So while many modernists are fascinated with past, ancient or primordial, marginalized modernists cannot adopt the distanciation so readily embraced by their counterparts, this kind of distance. So they can't ascribe to T.S. Eliot's celebrated poetics of impersonality, for instance, that comes up in tradition and individual talent. So in that essay, Eliot famously encourages the writer to sacrifice their authorial personality from the work of art. But what I'm arguing is that those who are regularly appropriated or immolated recognize themselves as the sacrificed, those who are sort of taken up as the sacrificial victim. Malediction is their daily experience, a kind of death by 1,000 cuts, experiences this experience attends this experience of being marginalized. The ancient ritual of sacrifice is a complete Loy fascination, particularly where women are concerned. Loy's writings foreground how women are sacrificed as impossible ideals, as virgins, saints, madonnas, or the beautiful, but also as whores and shrews. So Loy's feminist manifesto is probably her most famous example of this fascination with sacrifice. And I'm giving you the sort of standout quote that always becomes the subject of every seminar when you teach Loy's feminist manifesto, in which she's using a model very akin to Swift's A Modest Proposal. She advocates for the surgical destruction of the hymen of all girls before puberty. And in so doing, she's calling attention to women's treatment as an object of exchange on the marriage market, right? If we just get rid of all women's hymens, then they no longer have that value in the marriage market. This virginal value gets eradicated by this action. So it's about calling attention to how anatomy is the thing for which women are valued. This 1914 manifesto is a really good example of Loy's process. Loy writes satires that call attention to the immolation of the marginalized and then sacrifices the perpetrators of that marginalization in turn. One of my key arguments is that satire is literary sacrifice. We can equate these two things in literature. Satire is a public maiming or harming of figures seen to be surplus or negatable with a greater good in view. So this public maiming or harming of figures seen to be negatable is what satire is. Mina Loy is a feminist, though, and as a feminist, she, I think, reconfigures the history of satire. So satire traditionally aims at creating distance between oneself and one's enemy, an enemy typically found disgusting or hateful, right? Repulsive or loathsome. But Loy attacks her enemies with a view to bringing them closer and to level the hierarchy that exists between them. In this regard, Loy dovetails sort of fascinatingly with her contemporary, the French philosopher Georges Bataille, for whom sacrifice matters because, as I've written on your handout, in his strange myths and in his cruel rites, man is in search of a lost intimacy. So Loy pursues sacrificial intimacy with a view to universalizing vulnerability as a generative experience. So my second volume of this book builds on this argument. I'm focusing here in this second volume, Elevated Realms, more closely on Loy's relationship with the soul and the mystical cosmos. And in this book, I discuss how Loy longs to become a sage or a visionary. Now, in one sense, Loy has these oracular leanings. She wants to be an oracle, and this in itself is very consistent with satirical history, which is predicated upon the understanding that satirists from, since the dawn of writing and the creation of satire as a genre, satirists judge society, and that this judgment can be prophetic. There's always been an association between satire and prophecy. So Loy wants to become a visionary, of course. She's a satirist. That's what satirists want to be. But in another sense, I think, Loy's mysticism might be seen as a counterpart to her aggressive satirical urges. If satirical aggression can be equated to thanatos, or the death drive, it's through her mysticism that Loy develops a theory of Eros, of a compassionate feminist love that is platonic, romantic, filial, and also aesthetic. It's a very broad-based Eros. And this esoteric theory of Eros underpins the corporeal and spiritual dissections of Volume 2 of my anatomy. And that this volume is based on considering the complexities of Loy's lifelong spiritual quest, one that is literary and artistic, but also an act of devotion in the service of the corporeality of the divine. She's trying to bring together the corporeal and the spiritual. So in essence, Loy there's something very traditional about this too. She's kind of mystic, seeking an intimate relationship to the beyond. Okay, that's the background to those two books, about which there is far too much more to say. But what I'm going to do now is turn to esotericism and avant-gardism and how we might think of these two categories working symbiotically. Okay, the word esoteric is first recorded in a work called Philosophies for Sale, which was a satire by Lucian of Samosata, so it's written in the 2nd century. In Lucian's satire, Philosophies for Sale, Zeus auctions philosophers at a slave market, a process that is comically meant to expose the material and utilitarian limitations of their metaphysics. When Aristotle is put on the block to be auctioned, he is promoted as exceptionally good value because he is what Lucian calls double. He's one thing is seen from the outside and another thing seen from the inside. Lucian is referring here to the doublespeak of ancient philosophy, which was perceived as a set of coded messages or truths superior to the noble, unexamined lies that underpin everyday life. So Lucian's terms demonstrate how Aristotle offers an exoteric message to the casual reader, even as with avid sleuthing, deeper esoteric truths can be located in his writing. He's double. This internal mysteriousness breeds suspicion. Lucian scoffs at the supposedly elite, unattainable knowledge of Aristotle and his disciples, the Peripatetics. In turn, this disapprobation becomes foundational to the history of esotericism itself. In modernity, esotericism encompasses a spectrum that runs from the materiality of theurgic or magical practice to the ecstatic divinity of mysticism. It includes any number of discourses: alchemy, numerology, astrology, classical philosophy, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, New Age religions, occult practice, Rosicrucianism, Swedenborgianism, and theosophy. And I can assure you I am not an expert in all of those things. Often responsive to esoteric religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, the esoteric discursive transfer can also draw on science, on philosophy, on philology, and the law. Post-Enlightenment Western cultures developed a very deep anti-esoteric bias that shoehorned esotericism into a presiding rationalism, or defined it as oppositional, deviant, or just plain wrong, erroneous. Deemed subversive, the esoteric appeals to burgeoning avant-gardes who are keen to assert the viability of the irrational. And as soon as something becomes subversive, there's kind of interest there. This dissent is discernible as early as post-1790 Romanticism, where writers lamented a lost connection with the universe and, by extension, reappraised old magic and mysticism, Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, among other doctrines. Drawing on pre-modern practices, thinking, and beliefs, esotericism nevertheless irrefutably shapes modernity. From a literary perspective alone, an Anglo-literary perspective, its influence is discernible in the galvanism of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for instance, or the mesmerism of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And you have really obvious examples of how it plays its part. By extension, the esoteric has an under-examined purchase on how we think about high modernism. As Leon Surratt, who's one of the few critics who's written a book about this, compellingly asserts, for too long, scholars have disregarded the centrality of the occult, mystical, and secret history literature to the intellectual context in which literary modernism was born. So, in this regard, W.B. Yeats is always singled out as the rare canonical modernist who engaged in the occult, right? He's the kind of example of this. But many, many modernists, of course, kept alive this Victorian fascination. We just always gravitate to Yeats when we want an example of this. So, the widespread popularity of fantasioso occultism sought to reconcile the secular and the spiritual, the self-aware and the divine, body with the soul, all often paradoxically justified through scientific discourses. The Victorian pastime at the end of the 19th century was to prove the occult true, right? To bring science and the occult together so that there would be no divide between something that could be proven and something that was seen to be superstitious. Psychology emerges from this kind of late 19th century occultism. But where psychology replaced the spiritual soul with the irrational unconscious, the occult promoted a renegotiation of self that sought an accommodation with a unifying and transcendent spirituality. Stressing subjective harmony, the occult paved the way towards self-realization and a guilt-free rejection of outdated social morals. Goals with enormous appeal to avant-gardists like Mina Loy, who was a feminist opposed to the censoring of anatomy, sexuality, and women. This rejection of the outdated extends beyond aesthetic avant-gardism to political avant-gardism, so that occultists were often reformers and activists, campaigning on behalf of women's rights, the working classes, and animal welfare, among other than radical causes. But I think it is because of this very Victorian lineage that many modernists did not identify esotericism as a source of inspiration, right? So this is that old cliche that Victorians were your parents, and as a modernist, or a kind of adolescent modernist, did not want to be seen as connected to the Victorians. Right? The Victorians were too invested in the occult, and modernists pretended that they weren't themselves connected to it. For instance, scholars have only recently begun, at least certainly in English criticism, to uncover links between Italian futurism and the occult. Marinetti's earliest writings included Rosicrucian and Kabbalist tendencies, esotericism to which he returned in 1920 after he broke with Mussolini and became leader of Milan's occultism circle. And this is something that is never foregrounded in the criticism that I read in any case about Marinetti, but he was in charge of an occultism circle. Yet Marinetti was careful to cordon off his own occult interests as purely pragmatic or scientific. And in so doing, he is replicating the very Victorian model of the occult, connecting science and the occult again. Nevertheless, there are really strong links between futurism as a movement and the occult, too. Among them, the presence of renowned esotericists in various futurist chapters, the transmutation of occultist language to shore up futurist vitalism, which is an absolutely key tenet of futurism. There's evidence that the futurists, both skeptically and curiously, read occult literature, engaged in seances, and were influenced by Eastern religious traditions and parapsychology. But while futurist occultism has been noted, it is rarely thoroughly examined, almost like we have completely swallowed wholesale Marinetti's view that the occultist leanings had nothing to do with futurism. Similar gaps continue to beg redress in readings of modernist culture and politics writ large. But underpinned by new archaeological discoveries, folklore and anthropology, which are treatises on these topics, are coming thick and fast at the end of the 19th century, as well as religious histories and movements, esotericism was discernibly adopted throughout the 20th century by factions both radical and reactionary. So this influence spanned the anti-Christian, anti-positivistic mythologies of Marx and Nietzsche, but also the inner circle of Nazism, and so we had this kind of great political span on offer. However diametrically opposed, these affinities were rooted in shared resistances toward orthodoxies of church and state, resistances that, of course, also defined avant-garde movements. So, to link esotericism and avant-gardism, we think about esotericism as involving affiliation with the like-minded, be it a single enlightened adept in a select group of initiates, or an intellectual or spiritual lineage passed on from one generation to the next. Esotericism is a methodology, a committed pursuit to the metaphysical, transcendent, or Gnostic, to information or experience not immediately or readily available, be it philosophical truths, cosmological mysteries, or inner comprehension of the divine. That personal relationship to the divine is absolutely crucial to the esoteric. And some people argue even that Protestantism develops out of a kind of esoteric methodology, because it has a more direct relationship to God. Often defined by claims of higher knowledge and ways of accessing this knowledge, esoteric truths are understood to remain unutterable, requiring faith because they are beyond ready articulation. Secret or occluded knowledge that esotericism offers can be either allegorical and secular or symbolic and sacred. So resisting legibility, revering the obscure, as well as directly practicing an occultist practice, modernist writers engage in secular and sacred esoteric epistemologies. In some, members of avant-garde factions embrace both the content of esoteric gnosis and its practice, its method. Among them, intensive writerly and interpretive practices that eschewed the status quo, as well as the fostering of select groups with whom to share this complex knowledge. Today, it's a kind of vernacular to associate the esoteric with literary difficulty. Right? This is the way that the word gets used. Something's esoteric because it's hard to read. Texts that make initiates of readers demanding a kind of exegetical nous to uncover an authorial or artistic vision. As we all know in this room, there are any number of reasons for the modernist turn to writing that drew so heavily on readerly reserves, among them aesthetic pleasure, or the accurate renderings of everyday and internal chaos, resistance to prescriptive, predictable literary realism. So this is just so many reasons why modernist writing gets difficult. But at its most pragmatic and often its most incendiary, modernist difficulty dovetails with ancient philosophical esotericism, which actively withholds truths considered too dangerous for immediate or obvious release to the masses and their minders. Resisting censoriousness, embracing the uncertifiable and irrational, as well as difficulties of style and content, esotericism and high modernism share fundamental coordinates. so that modernist avant-gardes have been credited with the first wholesale equation of art with a mystical vision that remained unknowable to the uninitiated by design. That may be going too far, but that is a statement that has been made about the avant-garde. So now I'm going to shift into the conversation about Mina Loy more specifically. So Mina Loy, as I said, she was born in 1882. She comes of age in Avant-Gardism, England, a period of mystical revival during which in England interest in the occult and alternative spiritualities were perceived as the harbinger of a new transformative age. A quick survey illustrates how readily Loy's biographical coordinates coincide with key aspects of that occult discourse at the end of the 19th century. In 1882, the year that Loy was born, London Society for Psychical Research is formed, the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. It studies psychic and paranormal events, directly influencing the emergence of psychoanalysis, a discipline arguably as immersed in an esoteric inner gaze as phenomenology, the philosophical movement that surfaces in the same period. Loy avidly read the work of the Society for Psychical Research founder, Frederick Myers, who coined the term telepathy, and she also read Phenomenology of Henri Bergson, who became the Society for Psychical Research president in 1913. More coordinates. In 1875, Theosophy became the most significant school of esoteric thought in England, and its influence is discernible upon Loy's belief both in third eye and in reincarnation. And I'm not going to talk about that today, although that is a part of the book that I discuss extensively, how connected her work is and her thinking is to Blavatsky's writings. Furthermore, Loy's theories of esotericism increased following the publication of Literature and Occult Tradition, which was a book published in 1930 by Denis Sara, which is a seminal demonstration of how esotericism is foundational to Western literature and modernization. Mina Loy converted to Christian Science in 1909. This is a fact that's widely known about her. This was 30 years after it was established by the US-born Mary Baker Eddy. And Loy remained a loyal, if distractible, practitioner of Christian Science. She was prone to lapses and deviations. In one of her letters that she wrote in 1931, she says, "There are so many kinds of Christian Science." And there aren't. I don't think Baker Eddy would agree with her that there are so many kinds of Christian Science. Christian Science centers on biblical interpretation. It espouses spiritual individualism and faith-based self-healing aimed at evolving toward freedom from suffering and adversity. So Christian scientists tend not to go to the doctor. They believe that it's through the practice of prayer and faith that they can cure whatever ails their bodies. To this promise, Loy was immensely drawn. She never shied away from conflict or pain as a satirist or an avant-gardist. But in her spiritualism, she sought what she describes as an unembellished, non-contorted simplicity that affirmed the uneventful, I'm quoting her, the uneventful rhythm of life and the absolute okayness. So she wants a kind of space, a safe space, and this is what Christian Science is meant to provide for her. In Loy's time, there's so much to say about why she chooses Christian Science. Many people of Jewish origin convert to Christian Science. Many of them are women, right? So she's sort of tied up in a larger kind of demographic shift that Christian Science somehow comes to encapsulate for reasons that people continue to mull over. But Christian Science was also perceived as a popular alternative to psychoanalysis. And Loy applies science in precisely this manner, suggesting that it helps her overcome the trauma of her childhood. She had a very difficult upbringing, and keeps her from, in a letter of 1928, she writes, "It keeps me from going gaga. I do Christian Science to stay sane." But on occasion, Loy will just abandon science altogether, a choice justified by her assertion that as an esotericist, she chafes against extended exposure to any organized religion. So there's a resistance even to this subculture of a religion that is Christian Science. It's too organized for her. And because she has a right to explore whether or not an intellectual has got the right to his own God. Right? So, and this is a very esotericist position. I want to have an individual personal relationship with God, and it should not necessarily have anything to do with a large and growing organized faith. But even at her most devout, Loy used her religion very instrumentally. She turned to it more often when she was sick than when she was well, and when she experienced needs for the creature comforts that fall outside, very far outside of strict science purview. So she, in her correspondence, is immensely telling and quite grasping, actually, about her relationship to her faith. She's having difficulty getting a pair of false teeth fitted, and so she wants a really good, well-fitted pair of false teeth. She turns to Christian Science and sort of hopes that this is going to come to her. And in a shockingly hilarious letter from her daughter is about to get a series of photographs of herself taken, so she brings a Christian Science practitioner to her house to treat the angles of her face so she'll look terrific in the photo shoot, right? So this is the kind of way in which they're using their Christian Science. Which is not at all how Baker Eddy wanted treatments for Christian Science to be used. Further complicating this picture is the truth that to convert to her chosen sect, to science, Loy had to turn a blind eye to its complete derogation of the body, which was always enthralled by the terms of Christian Science of the mind. It's mind over matter. Okay? So there is that sort of proselytizing that if you become ill, you have done something wrong, you've lost your way, you've lost your faith, and therefore you must come back to your faith in order to become well again. Quite unlike Loy, the science founder Baker Eddy eschews sentient material forms and counsels bodily forgetfulness. And this is her way of dealing with pain, heartbreak, loss, injustice, and also with dealing with sexual desire, which she considers very, very negatively. And these are all terms, pain, heartbreak, loss, injustice, and sexual desire, that are absolutely crucial to Loy's writings. So a lot of critics have spent a lot of time wondering, why does she pick this particular faith? Also, Loy remained openly fascinated by rituals associable with mesmerism, hypnotism, spiritualism, and numerology, all of which Baker Eddy denounced as false beliefs. Reincarnation is another one. No, Christian scientists do not believe in reincarnation. Baker Eddy denounces things like mesmerism, no doubt in response to the widespread understanding that her own religion, Christian Science, was a pastiche of precisely these occult influences, right? So she's trying to keep herself at one remove from this legacy. From pursuing divine illumination to equating artistry and religion with magic, Loy's contact with the full esoteric spectrum was lifelong. Loy was connected to the infamous English occultist Aleister Crowley at the turn of the 20th century, which she was not happy about, but she didn't know who he was and he knew her. She was part of a community of mystics in Italy, and she became conversant with surrealist mysticism in the late 1920s. As a satirist, Loy mocked the sanctified factionalism of the avant-garde on esoteric grounds. So in some of her writings, she writes about Marinetti as the hyperbolic prophet of a new religion, for instance. And she presents his futurist rival, Giovanni Papini, as Christ or Zarathustra inhabiting a mountaintop in an attempt to become God that fails absurdly. And so she's really good at using kind of the language of esotericism to mock the avant-garde leaders that she associates with. But more seriously, Loy writes aesthetic treatises between the 20s and 40s that reverentially liken avant-garde leaders to esoteric adepts. So she can make fun of those kind of esoteric proclivities, but she can also be serious about them. Picasso's audience she describes as divided between discerning disciples and a myopic uninitiated. Gertrude Stein Loy describes as the enlightened, undeterred by the unenlightened. William Carlos Williams's verse possesses, in Loy's terms, complete integrity of meditation. And in her poem that she writes in 1923 about Joyce's Ulysses, she describes it or likens it to a kind of Empyrean divinity. So Loy is always at home with the illusory. Absolutism she considers a goal to be strategically avoided in art. Deeming life a great mystery, Loy encourages her reader to fare onward even on impact with the unknown. There's something quite Gnostic about this, right? When we turn to art for the unknown. But in a letter written in 1930, Loy attributed her own use of obscure language, that's her term, to aesthetic preference, and as importantly, to a need to get by the censor. Loy experienced censorship firsthand. She was present at the obscenity trial of the Little Review in 1921 after they published extracts from Joyce's Ulysses. And her own book, her one major book, Lunar Baedeker, was impounded by US Customs in 1923. Very few of those books actually made it into the country from Paris where they were published. In turn, Loy mistrusts the profane reader. And she writes in the 1930s, and this is on your handout, one has to avoid words with centuries of dirt and degradation clinging to them because you cannot expect your listener to bring an open mind to your clarifications. There's a lot of that kind of language in Loy's archive, that kind of suspicion of how her work is going to be interpreted. Yet at the same time, Loy wants to open up a conversation about the esoteric, and in particular, she wants to generate a greater openness about the physical and spiritual mysteries of sexual love, primarily with women in view. So this takes me to the next section of my talk, which is Loy's theory of esoteric Eros. So there will be some quotes from the handout in what follows. In 1917, Loy traveled to revolution-torn Mexico to reunite with her lover, Arthur Craven, who had become internationally itinerant in a bid to evade conscription. So Craven is traveling around from Newfoundland to Mexico, just trying to avoid being conscripted in essence. She follows him from New York to Mexico in 1917. Theirs is a torrid and wonderful love affair, so she's prepared to do this. Penniless and unemployed, the couple began to starve in Mexico, and they were ultimately saved by the serendipitous generosity of some expatriate friends who just showed up with a bunch of beefsteak and kept them from falling or heading toward their certain death. Having experienced this extreme deprivation, starvation is a thing that you can see Loy returning to again and again in her archive notes. Loy comes to the conclusion that asceticism does not foster mystical illumination, right? So doing away with worldly is not the way forward. Love, on the other hand, does. With pleasure, Loy describes how when she returns to Craven's long-awaited company in Mexico, distance got telescoped by locomotive power. And of their first days together, Loy writes, this is on your handout, somehow we had tapped the source of enchantment and it suffused the world. We must have anticipated the embrace of reunion as the consolatory absolute which no perspective of time could augment or reduce. Loy's love for Craven is described in this passage in particular through really esoteric terms. The macroscopic cosmos works in symbiosis with microscopic experience. This is key to esoteric thinking. The universe is magically, imaginatively animated, and visionary reveries and passions fuel transmutative transcendence. These are all esoteric processes. Loy and Craven are reunited in 1917. In 1918, Craven disappears, never to be seen or heard of again. His love, however, remains Loy's lifelong benchmark and foundation, the aim and ground of her transmissive proclivities. With a kind of didactic tone and proselytizing fervor, Loy takes on the role of adept, speaking to the uninitiated in her 1940s tract, which is called The History of Religion and Eros. Right? So she has this amazing love in her life, very briefly, but very ideally. And you can see from after that experience, she wants other people to understand how they too can access love. This kind of proselytizing enters into her discourse, which is not to say she wasn't didactic before, but this is the kind of direction it takes. This essay, History of Religion and Eros, an essay is a word I use very loosely. It's a very peculiar piece of writing. Loy describes the obligation borne by the Illuminati to impart to others the formula for its inducement. And by the end of History of Religion and Eros, she takes up this obligation, passing on the ancient understanding of the electric incitement of Eros that she believes was mishandled and subverted by exoteric religion. She cannot think that any religion that was really truly closely associated with the divine could possibly derogate the flesh in the way that so many exoteric religions have. So part of this essay is about rewriting and reassessing that tradition. Loy's re-estimation of sexual love in History of Religion and Eros extends in her contemporaneous crystal roman, these novels that she's writing and rewriting over and over again in her later years, to the revaluations of familial and self-love, as well as to passions for beauty and art. And there's a real Platonic influence. You can see how the symposium has influenced a lot of this thinking as well. But the History of Religion and Eros remains Loy's most extensive expository delineation of an esoteric Eros, an Eros that I defined through Loy and through the feminist theorist Adriana Caballero as sexual and emotional inclination, a willful turning away from the rectitudes of logic, esoteric morality, and gendered constraint. This is the kind of terminology of Loy's Eros. Relatedly, History of Religion and Eros is a culminating point of Loy's long-standing frustration at the limitation of Freud's powers of sexual revelation. So Loy is one of those modernists that has a very ambivalent relationship to Freud, who she did in fact meet and had read extensively. Loy admires how Freud established an open discussion of sex, and she never reneges on that commitment. She really believes that he was absolutely important, almost as important in the history of Western civilization as Christ. She sees Freud as another Jew who comes along and saves the world, fundamentally. So the fact that he opens up this conversation about sex is immensely impressive and important to her. However, she's deeply troubled by how, in opening up this conversation, Freud turns how she describes this as he turns sex into a routine duty, a universal habit lacking force or enchantment. Right? It's without enchantment. History of Religion and Eros is concerned with Freud's capacity to, and this is a quote too on your head, illuminate all but a blind spot, the electrification of bliss, or that terrain that has become an infinitely extensible maze of introversion in search of Eros. In another writing, Loy asks, if, as Freud infers, religion and sex are interchangeable, why not reintegrate both, giving the people an impetus toward the equilibrium they require, right? He comes so close to making this happen, bringing religion and sex together, and then he fails, right? And this is what she wants to better Freud. She thinks she can bring this noise where Freud hasn't. For Loy, religion is psychic gymnastics, an exercise of the spirit aspiring to enlightenment, illumination, ecstasy. And I'd ask you to pay attention to those terms, psychic gymnastics or an exercise of the spirit. Always the body infuses her descriptions of the mind or the spirit. The spirit needs exercising, it does gymnastics. And a passage from one of Loy's late novels clarifies the broad applicability of this orgasmic Eros. This is your last quote on the front page of your handout. As there is an amorous orgasm, which is the juncture of our sensibility with cosmic sentience, so there is a spiritual orgasm, the mystic's admittance to cosmic radiance, an intellectual one immingling with the intelligential ether, an aesthetic one on our impact with any of the myriad facets of cosmic beauty. So there is an orgasm of loving compassion, the lust of the humane. In some of her archived notes associated with this novel, Loy also compares ideation to a kind of brain orgasm. So love, religion, art, and intellection, they all offer satiation so great that they require a metaphor of the most overwhelming physical pleasure, sexual climax. This metaphor first emerges in response to the visceral sensation that overtakes the child Loy, she writes about this in her novels, when she meets her adoring paternal grandmother for the first time. Her grandmother was held at bay, Jewish origins, Protestant mother does not like this grandmother, so she meets her in a chance encounter on the street. And as she recalls this exchange in childhood, it's that relative's loving compassion that motivates Loy to pursue the lust of the humane, this lust that she's describing. But within this lust, and this kind of orgasmic radiance that she's attributing to so many facets of our being, women hold a special place for her. Entering the transformative state of love, Loy argues, so we're turning into the back of your handout here. Women cannot wander in and out of the sphere of normal conditions as men do, or present, as it were, a surface to love's contacts and associations. but that she is bound to absorb the phantasmagoric values to be found there until they become integral to her makeup. This is a really typical sentence of Loy's Kunst der Roman, which is probably why she had such a difficult time finding a publisher. In this instance, she's saying, women cannot enter and exit sexual exchange in the same way as men. She's bound to absorb phantasmagoric values. But in this instance, the phantasmagoric is not a prized Gnostic knowledge, but the accumulated lived falsehoods by which gender inequities are perpetuated, right? That is the phantasmagoria here, is gender inequality. So women become close to men and they absorb this kind of negative discourse. For Loy, the internalization of these mythologies creates a dependence on women's capacity to attract a male. Women become dependent. This is the next quote. As a direct consequence of this limited goal, woman becomes reliant on the charge of male electricity to hold her egoless amalgam together, so that when he withdraws his galvanic presence, she ceases to glow. And it gets odder. Yet woman remains cognizant of the fully desires life available to men because she possesses, this is terrific, a vaginal clairvoyance by which she can follow in her mate's emotions, which his contact will whip almost to delirium. So, the potentially enticing powers of vaginal clairvoyance prove disappointingly limited, right? We think, wow, the world is definitely the female voice here, but no, it's not true. Loy consigns women to a parasitic relationship to the vital sap drawn from their lovers. So they have this kind of borrowed lubricity from their lovers. But they, nevertheless, their nerves remain perpetually exhausted by the ultimate fictitious value by which they feel entirely void after the brief resuscitation of sex. So women are defined by an inconclusiveness, a sentience or mere being solely brought into generative animation with the assistance or validation of male desire. Woman is reduced to partiality, her greatest success, which is only available, this is crucial, to a certain percentage of women, is limited to becoming the object of immense desire. And only some women even get to this level of kind of sexual awareness and validation, and it's not even that great. But that certain percentage of women, Loy is constantly trying to marshal women into this kind of esoteric elect. Loy argues that the demands placed on women's appearance have increased since her youth, and she concludes in this passage from this romantic left that she's writing in 1930s, woman, the big review, still inconsummate. So this is being written roughly 3 decades after her feminist manifesto, in which she's arguing a very similar thing in the manifesto of 1914, which is, she says in the manifesto, stop looking to men to figure out who you are. Women, you've got to look within yourself and try to figure out who you are, but ultimately acknowledges that women still lack self-definition. So the manifesto says that. 3 decades later, she's writing this in this unpublished novel. Hope exists, however, Loy says, even the woman who is known as cold, but who would be more accurately described as smoldering, is capable of an esoteric kind of union with her man. So as Loy argues throughout her work, information about female pleasure is gnosis, a higher knowledge withheld from all but an elect, satiated few. I mean, who is Loy instructing here is a really good question, because none of the novels are ever published, nor is the Feminist Manifesto. This is something that I think when we teach it, we often forget to describe. It's now publicly available, but it was actually written in a letter to a friend, and she didn't publish it in her lifetime. Who is her audience, her envisioned audience? Really uncomfortably, in her late correspondence with her daughter, when her daughter marries, it becomes clear that she's using her daughter as this kind of this ideal initiate into her own thinking about women's sexuality. So she knows far too much about her daughter's sex life in her marriage. And she says, I just want to know that you are experiencing sexual pleasure. Like on the one hand, there's something sort of charming and caring about this, and on the other hand, it's just too much information. But she says, actually, in her letters to her daughter, if I can find out that by my instruction you have attained sexual satiation, I will be able to write the anti-Freud, right? I will be able to write the anti-Freud. So this is what this gives her permission to do, again, is to best Freud in a kind of feminist way. Which leads me to my next section, is to think about how Loy's thinking might be seen as sort of rippling outward into the 20th century, and how she herself is moored into thinking from the 19th century. So you can see some of Loy's ideas very clearly in the second generation psychoanalyst Karen Horney, who takes issue with Freud's formulation of woman as lack. Really terrific writings where she's like, what, we talk about penis envy, why not women? But just this is happening along the same time that Loy is writing some of these things, taking issue with Freud. Horney and others like her in turn lays ground for the 1970s écriture féminine, or Audre Lorde's mystical, all-encompassing feminist Eros. Right? Lorde is a really brilliant kind of theorization of Eros and how it underpins her own work, her activism, and her writing. Very akin to a lot of the kinds of things that Loy is writing. But where a feminist esoteric Eros is concerned, we can see Loy's descendants, and Irigaray is a really interesting figure in this regard, because her kind of satirical take on psychoanalysis dovetails very often with a lot of what Loy is doing. So there's these descendants, but Loy also has antecedents. And here we might turn to a figure who I think is going to slowly be recovered by modernist studies. The African-American Rosicrucian Pascal Beverly Randolph. Has anybody come into contact with Pascal Beverly Randolph? He describes himself, this is a quote from him, as the tawny student of esoterics. And he writes in 1874 a book called Euless, The History of Love, which advocates on behalf of a mystical, sublime approach to sex. Ever mysterious, Randolph's soul is most loving when sustained by a satiated, respected body, and as such, he demands greater equality between the sexes, discussing with remarkable frankness the need for men to better acquaint themselves with women's vulvas in order to generate the vital lymph key to happy heteronormative domesticity. I'm just going to say this again. He was writing this in 1874. It's in the introduction to his book. He starts getting into how men don't understand women's anatomy well enough. It's a really explicit and wonderfully frank kind of opening to a book that just carries on in this spirit. Randolph denounces the ubiquity of misogynistic male discourse. He encourages husbands to consider how their own sexual failures might contribute to their wives' adultery. He speaks with sympathetic outrage about backstreet abortions. And like Mina Loy, he venerates marriage as an occult relationship. It's a really interesting kind of precursor to some of Loy's thinking. Some of Randolph's ideas recur in the work of a thinker with whom Loy, absolutely we know, came into contact, the openly gay British utopian socialist Edward Carpenter. Carpenter writes a book that is republished many times in the modernist period called Love's Coming of Age. And in it, he connects love with cosmic energies and entities, describing the passion of sex as the divine made actual and realizable. Carpenter's sexual mysticism insists on the interdependence of terrestrial and celestial, establishes concordances between Eastern mysticism and Christianity, and turns human into God. Like Loy, Carpenter values women's sexual satiation and deplores the expectations that women sacrifice their personal interests and expansions in the ever-narrowing ground of domestic duty. Right? So he too sees women as kind of sacrificial victims of a patriarchal society. But alongside these antecedents is Loy's contemporary, the American writer H.D. or Hilda Doolittle. In 1919, H.D. writes a book that's not very much discussed in relation to H.D. called Notes on Thought and Vision. And it doesn't talk about lived gender disparities per se, but it propagates two centers of human consciousness, brain vision or intellect, and womb or love vision, right? Womb vision, the sort of vaginal clairvoyance, womb vision. Womb vision is the stuff of dreams, but also the workaday, the kind of ordinary and quotidian. Implicitly, anatomically, H.D. resituates the female body as central to the perception of a love that uncovers the gnomic, that exposes the mysteries of vision. She draws on Christian, Chinese, and ancient Greek sources, and H.D. sketches out a resolutely physicalized sexual mysticism, that prioritizes a healthy, beloved body as a means of approach to ecstasy, a vision most in focus when rational brain and loving womb work symbiotically. Neither Loy's nor HD's modernist feminist mysticisms were taken seriously by their male peers, as we might expect. Loy was dubbed by Marinetti a busy little mystic, and HD was considered Ezra Pound's dryad or tree sprite, and these epithets were not compliments. As William James writes in the Varieties of Religious Experience, the mystic temperament has long been aligned with psychopathology, acute moral sensitivity, and a sentimentality that is at odds with, and I quote James, your robust Philistine type of nervous system, forever offering its biceps to be felt, thumping its breast, and thanking heaven that it hasn't a single morbid fiber in its composition. In delineating a gender equitable gnomic transcendence, Loy and HD challenged their respective avant-garde Philistines, Marinetti and Pound, whose dismissals by diminution may speak to the threat posed by their feminist visions. Okay, I'm going to conclude, which is to say, in the wake of the 1921 trial of Ulysses, Loy writes a poem, and I've given you a bit of it on your handout, called Apology of Genius. It's 1922. And this poem posits literary indecency as alchemy, a forging of the dusk of chaos into a beauty discernible to the clear-sighted and clear-minded, to avant-garde mystic immortelles who take pleasure in being ostracized with God. Later in life, Loy asserts that due to sex liberation, censorship has defeated its own aims, precluding the need for esotericism. Right? We're finally free. We don't need esoteric thinking anymore. There is no secret to be kept, Loy writes, when all are in the secret, and she bemoans censoriousness on these grounds. A censoriousness in which she often feels compelled in her own writing to participate, or in which she works to advantage as an avant-garde writer of difficult poems that were believed to be obscene. While heterodoxy can generate clannishness that is a protective or exclusive kind of clannishness, Loy has a drive to expose esoteric truths, among them the unexplored pathways to women's transcendence. Loy is driven by, and at times opposed to, avant-garde esotericism. She mocks, she venerates, and engages in its precepts and methods. For while esoteric elitism has often been defended as necessary and generative, it arguably flies in the face of what Peter Berger considers the great strength of early 20th century avant-garde movements, namely their bid to excise the divide between aesthetics and life. Right? So art as an institution, as a kind of separate, lofty, theoretical sphere, is something that the avant-garde, according to Berger's theory, is trying to rid itself of, to bring it into the everyday. But it may well be Berger's avant-garde practice that fuels Loy's late desire to articulate the esoteric machinations of her writing and of her age, and her desire to open up a feminist conversation about divine climactic love in an alienating and moralizing world. Thank you so much for listening.